The envelope arrived on Meghan Markle's wedding day, slipped under her dressing room door at Windsor Castle while her makeup artist was touching up her foundation. No return address, just her name written in shaky handwriting that looked elderly, female, and vaguely familiar in a way that Meghan's stomach dropped. She should have ignored it, should have handed it to security and focused on the fact that she was about to marry a prince in front of 2 billion people. Instead, she locked herself in the bathroom and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photograph, faded and creased, showing two people who looked so much alike they could have been twins. Except the handwriting on the back, in that same shaky script, identified them as father and daughter, and the daughter was her grandmother Janet, young and pregnant, standing next to a man whose face Meghan recognized from another photo she'd found years ago in Doria's belongings, a photo her mother had snatched away and refused to discuss. Tucked behind the photograph was a birth certificate, Janet Arnold's original from Louisiana, with names that made everything Meghan thought she knew about her family collapse like a house of cards. The father's name and the grandfather's name were the same person. Below the photo, 3 words were written in that elderly hand: "I know everything." No signature, no demands, just that simple threat and the evidence that someone out there had the power to destroy Meghan's life on what should have been the happiest day she'd ever known. She had 20 minutes before she needed to walk down that aisle. 20 minutes to decide if she was going to confess to Harry, call off the wedding, or gamble that whoever sent this envelope would stay silent. She chose wrong, and that choice would poison everything that came after. Meghan walked down that aisle with the envelope burning in her clutch bag, hidden under her lipstick and compact mirror. Every smile was performance. Every vow felt like another lie stacking on top of the one she'd already told. Harry looked at her with such pure love and certainty that the guilt nearly broke her right there in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury. He had no idea that his bride was being blackmailed, that someone had chosen this precise moment to reveal they held evidence of a family scandal so toxic it could invalidate their entire marriage. The ceremony passed in a blur of liturgy and music and camera flashes. Meghan kept scanning the crowd, trying to figure out who had delivered that envelope, who knew her secret and had chosen today of all days to make their knowledge clear. Was it someone in the chapel watching her squirm? Or had they sent it and disappeared, content to let the threat hang over her like a sword? She couldn't ask security to investigate without explaining what was in the envelope, and explaining meant confessing to Harry, and confessing meant watching everything she'd worked for disintegrate before the reception even started. The first few months of marriage were torture. Meghan waited for the next contact, the actual demands, the price for silence. She checked her mail obsessively, both physical and digital, jumping every time an unknown number called her phone. She started having panic attacks in private, hyperventilating in bathrooms and closets where nobody could see her fall apart. Harry noticed something was wrong, but Meghan blamed it on adjustment to royal life, on the pressure and the protocol and the constant media scrutiny. He believed her because he'd seen those things destroy his mother, so it made sense that Meghan would struggle too. That made it easier for Meghan to hide the real source of her anxiety, but it also made her feel worse. She was using his family trauma as a shield for her own deception, weaponizing his worst memories to protect her lies. The guilt compounded daily, but not enough to make her tell the truth. She was in too deep, invested in the fairy tale, convinced that confession would hurt worse than continued secrecy. 3 months after the wedding, the second envelope arrived at Nottingham Cottage, their temporary home on the grounds of Kensington Palace. This time, it came through regular mail, with a postmark from Birmingham, but no return address. Inside was another photograph, this one showing Janet as a teenager with a man who had to be at least 60. The back of the photo identified him as her father, and the way he had his hand positioned on her shoulder, possessive and wrong, told a story that made Meghan want to vomit. There was also a photocopy of a medical record from 1950 showing Janet Arnold, age 16, receiving treatment for injuries that the coded language of the era couldn't quite hide. The document listed her father as her next of kin and the person who'd brought her to the hospital.
The pattern was becoming clear: the generational abuse and the family conspiracy to hide it. But this envelope also included something new: a handwritten note on lined paper that read, "Your mother knows I have these. Ask her why she never told you." That's when Meghan realized this wasn't just blackmail, it was psychological warfare from someone who understood exactly how to cause maximum damage.
Confronting Doria was one of the hardest things Meghan had ever done. She flew her mother to London under the pretense of wanting help decorating the cottage, then sat her down with both envelopes spread across the table between them. Doria's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, fear, resignation, and finally a kind of exhausted sadness that aged her 10 years in seconds. She'd known this day would come eventually, she said. She'd hoped Meghan would never have to deal with it, that the past could stay buried where it belonged. But secrets like this have a way of surfacing, especially when you marry into a family that documents bloodlines like other people document tax returns. Doria explained what she knew, which wasn't everything, but was more than enough. Janet had been the victim of her own father for years, in a situation that the family had covered up because that's what families did in rural Louisiana in the 1940s and 50s. You protected your own, even when your own were monsters. Janet had gotten pregnant at 16, given birth to Doria, and spent the rest of her short life trying to escape the stigma and the memories. The identity of Doria's father was the part that made everything exponentially worse. It wasn't just that Janet's father had abused her, it was that he was Doria's biological father too, making him both grandfather and father, collapsing the family tree in on itself in a way that had genetic implications Meghan didn't want to think about. Doria herself had only learned the full truth when Janet was dying of cancer in 1984, a deathbed confession that explained why their family was so small, why Janet had always been so secretive, why certain relatives were never discussed. Doria had made the decision then to bury the information forever, to protect herself and eventually protect Meghan from knowledge that served no purpose except to cause pain. She'd changed some names on official documents, lost some records, created strategic gaps in the paper trail. It had worked for decades, allowing Meghan to grow up with a sanitized version of her ancestry that didn't include words like incest or abuse or genetic damage. But someone had kept the real records, the photographs, the evidence, and now that someone was using them to torment Meghan at the precise moment when exposure would cause maximum devastation.
Doria had a theory about who was behind the envelopes, a name that made Meghan's blood run cold. Claudette's sister, Janet's aunt, a woman named Pearl who had to be in her 90s if she was still alive. Pearl had been there through all of it, had helped cover it up, had taken some of the photographs that were now being sent to Meghan. She'd moved to England in the 1960s, Doria thought, married someone British, and disappeared from the American side of the family. If she'd somehow learned about Meghan's engagement to Harry, if she'd decided that the royal wedding was her moment to cause chaos or extract payment for decades of silence, she'd have both motive and means. But tracking down a 90-something woman who might not even exist anymore was nearly impossible, especially without involving authorities or investigators who would ask questions Meghan couldn't answer. She was trapped, waiting for the next move in a game where she didn't know the rules or the stakes. The third envelope arrived 6 months later, and this time it included a demand: £2 million transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands, or the documents would be sent to every major British tabloid simultaneously. The note was typed rather than handwritten, more professional and cold than the previous messages. It gave Meghan 1 week to comply and included specific instructions about the transfer to ensure it couldn't be traced. This was the moment where Meghan should have gone to the police, to Harry, to palace security. But she'd been lying for so long that confession felt impossible. How could she explain why she'd hidden the first 2 envelopes? How could she justify paying blackmail without explaining what was being used against her? And if she explained the secret, she'd lose everything anyway, so what was the point of involving authorities? The logic was twisted, but it made sense to Meghan's panicked brain. She started liquidating assets, selling jewelry and calling in favors, trying to scrape together money without Harry noticing significant withdrawals from their shared accounts.
She almost made it.
She had £1.7 million assembled from various sources, was planning to borrow the rest from a friend in California who wouldn't ask too many questions. But Harry found the burner phone she'd been using to communicate with her contacts about the money. He thought she was having an affair at first, which might have been easier to explain than the truth. When he confronted her and she broke down, when the full story came pouring out along with months of suppressed terror and guilt, his reaction was worse than anything she'd imagined. It wasn't anger or disgust, it was complete shock that evolved into something that looked like betrayal, but felt like grief. She'd lied to him for their entire relationship. She'd walked down the aisle knowing she was being blackmailed and said nothing. She'd been preparing to pay £2 million to a criminal rather than trust him with the truth. Every choice she'd made had prioritized self-preservation over their partnership. And Harry was realizing in real time that the woman he'd married might not be who he thought she was at all. The investigation that followed was handled privately by palace security and involved resources that Meghan didn't know existed. They tracked the Cayman account to a shell company registered in Birmingham. The handwriting samples from the first envelope were analyzed and compared to records from various databases. Within 2 weeks, they had an identity. Pearl Arnaud, age 93, living in a care facility in Leeds. She was Janet's aunt, exactly as Doria had suspected, and she'd been living off a modest pension supplemented by occasional assistance from social services. The motive became clear when investigators interviewed the facility staff. Pearl had expensive medical needs that weren't covered by NHS, and her savings had run out years ago. She'd seen Meghan's engagement announcement and recognized her, remembered Janet and Doria and the family secrets she'd helped conceal decades earlier. In her mind, twisted by age and desperation and maybe early dementia, she'd convinced herself that Meghan owed her something, that the royal connection meant money was available and she had leverage to get it. She'd recruited her grandson to help with the technological aspects of the blackmail, the untraceable email accounts and offshore banking. It was sad and pathetic, and still capable of destroying everything Meghan had built.
The palace lawyers arranged a deal that kept everything quiet. Pearl was moved to a better facility with her medical expenses covered for life, in exchange for surrendering all photographs, documents, and copies related to Meghan's family history. The grandson was threatened with prosecution for blackmail and cybercrimes if he ever spoke about the situation. The care facility staff signed comprehensive NDAs after receiving financial incentives that made cooperation more appealing than selling stories to tabloids. It was the kind of efficient damage control that the royal family had perfected over centuries, making problems disappear through strategic application of money and legal pressure. But it came with strings attached for Meghan. The palace now owned her completely. They had documentation of everything, from the Louisiana birth certificates to the blackmail demands to Meghan's willingness to pay rather than seek help. If she ever stepped out of line, if she ever threatened the institution or caused problems for the family, they had enough material to destroy her credibility and paint her as a liar who'd deceived everyone from the start. Harry's trust was the real casualty. He stayed with Meghan, fulfilled his public duties, smiled for the cameras, but the foundation of their relationship had cracks running through it that couldn't be repaired. He'd given up everything for her, genuinely believing they were partners facing the world together. Finding out she'd been lying to him from their wedding day forward, that she'd been dealing with blackmail and family scandals without trusting him enough to ask for help, made him question every moment of their relationship. Was any of it real? Had she ever truly loved him? Or was he just a means to an end, a prince-shaped solution to her problems? Meghan swore that her love was genuine, that the lies were about shame and fear, not manipulation. But Harry had grown up surrounded by people who said whatever was necessary to get what they wanted, and he'd thought Meghan was different. Discovering she wasn't hit him harder than any tabloid attack or family criticism ever had.
The decision to leave England and move to California wasn't about escaping racism or media intrusion, though those factors were real and significant. It was about escaping the palace's leverage over them, putting physical distance between themselves and an institution that now had the power to destroy Meghan whenever it chose. Harry thought that by leaving, by giving up his royal duties and income, He could reset the power dynamics and build a life where they weren't constantly under threat. But the palace's information didn't become less dangerous just because they moved continents. If anything, it became more potent, a guaranteed way to bring them back in line if they ever went too far in their public criticism of the royal family. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, the memoir Harry published, all of it was carefully calibrated to criticize without crossing the line that would trigger the palace to release what they knew about Meghan's background and her wedding day deception. Living under that threat changed both of them. Meghan became even more controlling, trying to manage every aspect of their public image because she knew how quickly it could all collapse. Every interview was scripted, every public appearance choreographed, every business deal vetted for potential conflicts or exposures. She was trying to build an empire of influence and income that would be scandal-proof, diversified enough that one revelation couldn't topple everything. But the paranoia that drove her also poisoned her relationships. Business partners found her difficult and demanding, staff turned over constantly, unable to handle her micromanagement and mood swings. The warm, charming woman who'd won over a prince became someone harder and colder, someone who trusted no one completely, because trust was what had nearly destroyed her.
Harry struggled with depression that went deeper than what he'd experienced after his mother's death. This wasn't grief for something lost. It was disillusionment about something that had never been real in the first place. He'd built his entire adult identity around being the rebel prince who chose love over duty, who walked away from an institution that had killed his mother. But if the love story was compromised from the beginning, if Meghan had been lying and the institution had been covering for her while simultaneously collecting leverage, then what was his identity actually built on? The confusion and anger manifested in ways that concerned those around him. He withdrew from friends, spent hours alone, and developed anxiety that made public appearances increasingly difficult. The man who'd once been known for his charisma and ease with people became awkward and tense, unable to fake enthusiasm for the various projects and causes that were supposed to define his post-royal life. The children represented both hope and complication. Archie and Lilibet were innocent of their parents' mistakes and their great-great-grandmother's trauma, but they carried genetic markers that told the Louisiana story, evidence that couldn't be hidden or explained away if anyone ever looked closely enough. Meghan and Harry had to decide how much to tell them as they grew older, how to prepare them for the possibility that their family history might become public, despite everyone's best efforts to bury it. It was a burden neither parent wanted to pass on, but there was no way to avoid it. The truth was written in DNA, documented in records that couldn't all be destroyed, remembered by people who wouldn't live forever but might talk before they died. The best Meghan and Harry could do was try to control the narrative when it eventually emerged, getting ahead of the story rather than letting someone else define it. The relationship with Doria became strained after the blackmail situation was resolved. Meghan blamed her mother for not warning her sooner, for letting her walk into a royal marriage without understanding the full scope of what could be used against her. Doria argued that she'd been trying to protect Meghan, that knowing wouldn't have changed anything except to burden her earlier. The argument was circular and painful, highlighting how secrets corrode relationships, even when kept with good intentions. They barely spoke for 6 months after Meghan's confession to Harry, and when they finally reconciled, there was a distance that hadn't existed before. Doria stopped visiting as frequently, stopped offering unsolicited advice, treated her relationship with Meghan more like an obligation than a source of joy. She'd spent decades carrying the weight of her mother's trauma, and now that it had nearly destroyed her daughter's life anyway, she seemed exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The ongoing threat of exposure became part of daily life, something Meghan had to factor into every decision. When offered a political role or endorsement opportunity, she had to consider whether increased scrutiny would lead someone to dig into her background. When approached about reality shows or documentaries, she had to weigh the exposure value against the risk of giving genealogists and conspiracy theorists more material to work with. The calculations were exhausting and constant, turning every opportunity into a potential disaster. She started turning down more than she accepted, becoming known in Hollywood as difficult and uncommercial, someone whose baggage outweighed her value. The irony was brutal. She'd married a prince thinking it would elevate her career and profile, but the secrets that marriage had nearly exposed were now limiting her more than her pre-royal career ever had. The palace's strategy was masterful in its cruelty. They didn't need to actively threaten Meghan or leak information to control her. The mere existence of the documentation was enough. She knew they had it, she knew what it would do if released, and that knowledge shaped every choice she made. When she criticized the royal family, she had to be vague enough that they wouldn't retaliate. When she built her brand, she had to avoid anything that would draw their ire. She was on a leash made of her own secrets, pulled by an institution that didn't even need to remind her it was there. The control was psychological and total, exactly the kind of soft power the monarchy had been exercising for centuries. They didn't need to destroy her publicly. The threat of destruction was sufficient to keep her in line. Harry eventually had to confront what his life had become. He'd left the royal family to escape exactly this kind of manipulation and control, but he'd ended up in a different trap of his own making. His wife had lied to him, his family had leverage over them both, and the life they'd built in California was more about avoiding disaster than creating happiness. The Netflix deals and podcasts and speaking engagements were just elaborate forms of damage control, ways to stay relevant and solvent while navigating a minefield of secrets and threats. This wasn't freedom, it was a different kind of prison, one with better weather and less protocol, but fundamentally the same. He was still trapped by birth and circumstance and choices he couldn't undo, still unable to live authentically because authenticity would trigger consequences he couldn't afford. The question that haunted both of them was whether their marriage could survive long-term under this kind of pressure. Love, even genuine love, gets corroded by sustained stress and deception. They'd started couples therapy shortly after the blackmail situation was resolved, but therapy only works if both people are willing to be vulnerable and honest. Meghan struggled with that, her instinct for self-preservation making it hard to fully let her guard down, even in private. Harry struggled with trusting anything she said, always wondering if there were more secrets she was keeping, more lies waiting to surface. The therapist did what she could, but she was working against years of trained deception and institutional trauma that went back generations. Progress was slow and inconsistent, with breakthroughs followed by setbacks that sometimes felt worse than not trying at all. The public had no idea any of this was happening. They saw a couple who'd left the royal family, made some business deals, and were trying to build a life in California. Some people supported them, others criticized them, but nobody knew about the wedding day envelope or the Louisiana secrets or the palace leverage that shaped every decision. The narrative was about racism and media intrusion and institutional cruelty, which were all real factors but not the complete story. The truth was buried under layers of PR strategy and legal agreements and mutual threats, accessible only to the few people who'd been directly involved. Everyone else was arguing about a fairy tale, debating whether Harry and Meghan were victims or villains, never knowing that the real story was so much more complicated and tragic than either version suggested. What makes this situation especially cruel is that Meghan's actual crime was being born into a family with secrets. She didn't choose her grandmother's trauma, didn't create the situation that made her ancestry problematic, but she chose to hide it, chose to lie rather than trust, and those choices had consequences that compounded the original problem. If she'd been honest with Harry before they married, if she'd said, "My family history is complicated and potentially scandalous," maybe they could have faced it together. Maybe the palace would have stopped the wedding, or maybe they would have married anyway, with full knowledge of the risks. Either outcome would have been better than the current situation where nobody really trusts anyone and the secrets just keep multiplying. That's the real lesson here, that deception compounds itself, that one lie requires another and another until you can't remember what truth looks like anymore.
The children's futures remain the biggest unknown. Archie and Lilibet will grow up in California, insulated from the worst of the royal drama, but not immune to it. When they're old enough to use the internet, they'll find articles about their parents and speculation about their family history. They'll have to be told something, given a framework for understanding why their lives are different from other kids, why people write nasty things about their mother, and why their father seems so sad sometimes. Meghan and Harry will have to decide how much truth to share and at what age. Do you tell a 10-year-old that their great-great-great-grandfather abused his daughter and that's why their family tree is complicated? Do you wait until they're teenagers? Do you ever tell them at all? There are no good answers, just a spectrum of bad options and the hope that whatever they choose causes minimal damage. For now, Meghan and Harry continue the performance. They attend events, launch initiatives, give carefully controlled interviews that say enough to maintain relevance without saying too much. They present themselves as partners and parents working to make the world better. And maybe that's even true on some level. But underneath the public image is a relationship damaged by secrets and a life constrained by threats neither of them can fully escape. The envelope that arrived on Meghan's wedding day set events in motion that can't be undone, revealing vulnerabilities that enemies, both obvious and hidden, have learned to exploit. Whether they ultimately survive it depends on factors neither of them controls. Who else knows what? Who decides to talk? What technology makes possible in terms of genealogical research and DNA analysis? They're playing defense in a game they can't win, just trying to last long enough for the public to lose interest or for something bigger to come along and make their secrets irrelevant. It's exhausting and unsustainable, but it's the life they have now, built on foundations of shame and lies and desperate choices made in moments of panic. The fairy tale died the moment Meghan opened that envelope, and what's left is just two people trying to survive the aftermath while protecting children who deserved better than to inherit generational trauma disguised as royal heritage.